Living through a war is difficult enough, but what about living after the war? Chang-Rae Lee explores that in The Surrendered, which follows the lives of three very different people whose paths intersect in the aftermath of the Korean War. This is Chang-Rae Lee's fourth novel. His first native speaker received the Hemingway Foundation Pen Award. He's also won the Asian American Literary Award and was selected by The New Yorker as one of the 20 best American writers under the age of 40. In today's New York Times, Michiko Kakutani calls The Surrendered, which is published by Riverhead, a gripping and fiercely imagined work that burrows deep into the heart of war, leaving us with a choral portrait of the human capacity for both barbarism and transcendence. I'm very pleased that it brings Chang-Rae Lee back to our show today. Hi.
Hi, Leonard.
The novel opens in Korea in the 1950s. Long before you were born, what was the status of the Korean War at that time?
You mean after the 1950s?
At the beginning of the book.
Well, the book starts out in 1950, just on the eve of hostilities, and it concerns one of the main characters. She's only about 11 years old at the time. She's traveling with her two fraternal twins, siblings, and they're on a train heading southward.
Her name is June,
and her name is June. They're presumably heading toward safety, but the thing that makes this journey a little different is that they're on top of the train because the train is full, and of course that leads to some trouble and misfortune.
You're not willing to reveal that? That's where the book begins.
Well, what happens in the course of the ride, and of course there's memories of the days that have brought them there, the initial rousing from their homes, the execution of her father, the conscription of her older brother, and then the deaths of her mother and sister.
And that she watches as the train runs over her siblings, amputating their legs, causing them to bleed to death. Didn't something similar happen to your father?
Well, it did, and his description of it to me was just a few sentences, not at all detailed. But he told me about his brother, who was younger than he, and the same exact thing happened. The train that they were riding atop lurched in the middle of the night, and he fell between the cars. And
you said your father hardly spoke about it. But
no.
Did you have a sense that he had been scarred by that? It's such a horrific thing to experience.
I could only assume he'd been scarred, but you'd never know it by meeting the man, or up until that point, my living with him for 22 years. He'd never mentioned it. But of course, when he did talk about it, it was very painful for him. And in fact, it was so painful, and I hadn't seen his face contort in that way. He didn't quite cry. And I told myself that I probably should not ask him about this again.
Well, you've written about other people who've been scarred by the horrors of war. Doc Hatta, the protagonist of your second novel, A Gesture Life, is haunted by memories of his wartime service in Burma and the brutal mistreatment of the Korean women by the Japanese military.
Yeah, well, that's a story, obviously, that came about from my historical research, and of course, I felt I had a personal and familial connection to it, or at least a connection of heritage, and my own shock at my ignorance of that time. So that story involves war and involves suffering, but I saw that more historically. This story and this novel, I would say, is in many ways the book that I have the deepest emotional connection to, and not just because of what happened to my father.
Chang-Rae Lee's latest novel is called The Surrendered. It's published by Riverhead Books. Could you read a little bit for us?
Yeah, sure.
And by the way, while you're looking for a passage, you've been here for all of your novels, and
is that a record? Every single one?
You may be. We tried to do that with Joyce Carlos, but we didn't have enough years. I've only been here 25 years. But still, it's been 6 years since I last saw you.
Yes. And
has this book taken that long?
It took about 4.5 years of concentrated and earnest writing. And I think it's because of the scale of the story, the multiple primary characters, And then also, I think it took me a long time to feel comfortable with my approach to the story and the language that I wanted to use for
And
the
writing
story.
it in first person? I mean, third person?
No, actually that wasn't so much of a problem. I actually felt so much more liberty and possibility, and I'm thinking now that maybe I'll never write in first person again. But
Or I guarantee somewhere along the line you'll alternate first and third.
I probably will. But the third person, of course, as Russell Banks once told me that when you have too many choices, it's a problem, and sometimes that got to be an issue.
Because first person forces you to always be in the mind of your character.
Yeah, and those first three books of mine are so much aside from what they're about, the subject matter and their settings. There's so much about an inquiry into a certain kind of consciousness.
What are you going to read for us?
This is just the first couple paragraphs of the book, and it opens up with them on the train. The journey was nearly over. The night was unusually chilly, the wind sharpened by the speed of the train as it rolled southward through the darkened valley. The cotton blanket June had stolen was large enough to spread as a tarp, and at the same time wrap around her younger brother and sister and herself. But it was threadbare, and for brief stretches the train would accelerate and the wind would cut right through to them. It had not been a problem the night before, but now they were riding on top of the boxcar, as there was no more room within any of them, even as the train was more than a dozen cars long. A massive phalanx of refugees had met the train at the last station, and in the time it took her siblings to relieve themselves by the side of the tracks, they had lost their place and had to climb the rusted ladder between the cars, June running alongside for 50 meters until her brother was high enough on the rungs so she herself could jump up and on.
Chang-Rae Lee, reading from his latest novel, The Surrendered, which is published by Riverhead.
It's great.